My guest today is Dr. Paul Heggarty, who is a researcher at PUCP in Lima, Peru. His research focus is on language prehistory, aiming to ensure that the perspectives from linguistics is better understood outside that field. He works closely with archaeologists, geneticists, and historians. Welcome, Paul.
Hello. Hi.
Yeah, so thanks for doing this. So I want to start. So you have done a lot of research in this area. As I mentioned, Paul, I know nothing about archaeology or linguistics. And so I'm hoping to learn something from this conversation. So it's our audience. So I want to start with one of your papers. Language trees with sampled ancestors support a hybrid model for the origin of Indo-European languages. So you say here, languages of the Indo-European family are spoken by almost half the world's population, but their origins and patterns of spread are disputed. So your database of 109 modern and 52 time-calibrated historical Indo-European languages, you say you look at emergence of Indo-European languages around 8,000 years before present. And this is a deeper root date than previously thought, and it fits with an initial origin south of the Caucasus, followed by a branch northward into the steppe region. So before we get into the details of this, Paul, so what exactly is Indo-European languages?
It's the best way to conceive of it is as a family of languages. I mean, if you want a parallel in biology, you might say the felines, the cat family. So you have a whole range of modern cats species that are, tigers, lions, domestic cats, a bit of difference because they're domesticated, but ocelots, pumas, all of that family of animals, and they're all related to each other. They're more closely related to each other than they are to anything else. And in linguistics, the same sort of evolution. The processes are very different, but what Darwin called descent with modification in species, that happens in languages as well. So you can have an ancestor language, so spoken Latin, and once it expands with the Roman Empire into different areas, the languages are always changing anyway. Nobody can really stop that. But once one language gets implanted in different areas, like it did spreading out of Rome into different parts of the Roman Empire, then the changes start happening differently in different places. And so you get divergence into these related languages. They all come from the same ancestor. So Latin, another term for it in linguistics could be Proto-Romance. And so if you, again, to go back to the biological parallel, if you're comparing all these species of felines, then there was once a proto-cat. There was once some animal that gave rise to, through descent with modification down these different branches and divergence, you get all of these related cat species, and some of them are more closely related to each other than others are within that family. You get sub-branches and subspecies and so on. And there's a fairly similar process going on with language diversification. So I just mentioned the Romance languages that come from Latin, but long before Latin, there was a language which we call Proto-Indo-European. We don't have any records of it. It wasn't written. This was thousands of years before writing. But by comparing the modern languages and the historical ones we know, we can go back and reconstruct this Proto-Indo-European language. And it's called Indo-European because this family of languages extends from India to Europe. So people just use the geographical extremes of where it's found. In fact, it's spoken in Bangladesh as well, and Bengali is another language of this family. It goes even a bit further east then, and it's also a past branch of this language family that's now extinct. Tocharian was spoken in what's now Xinjiang in China. And then, of course, with European expansion, Indo-Europe, the European branches of it spread to the New World, spread to parts of Africa, Australia, and so on.
So what evidence do we have? So if I look backward 8,000 years from the present, what evidence do we have this 100 or so languages that you mentioned here in the database that they're related? What's evidence for that?
Yeah, the evidence is in how the languages are really. I mean, even if you count, this is not how linguists would do it, but if you look at the numbers from 1 to 10, yeah, and you can compare them in Hindi, for example, and in Persian, even modern day Hindi and Persian, and you compare them to, let's say, French and English and Spanish and Russian. If you listen just to those pronunciations, you could actually tell that there's some sort of strange resemblance going on. Yeah, so you'll still get a word. Words for 9 tend to start with an N. Words for 10s tend to start with a T or a D. Yeah, same for words for 2, also tend to start with a T, and 3. The 6 and 7 words tends to start with an S.
Yeah.
And this, if you just looked across languages of the world, if there was no deep connection between a language, you would find you wouldn't find this pattern of recurrent sounds in the same meanings. And the resemblances across Indo-European languages in a small set of very stable words are far greater than you could expect by chance. And so, in fact, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, so sorry to interrupt. So you're saying that if these languages started arbitrarily independently, then you wouldn't find this type of sort of relationships or similarities between those languages, and hence we can look at the similarities. So that you have a very large database of information here. So we can look at the similarities and work our way back in time, looking for something ancestral to all of these things, right? Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah, and in fact, we're lucky with Indo-European. It's relatively difficult in that this is an old language family, so there's been millennia of change, and language changes pretty quickly. If you think that a language like English and a language like German have only been diverging for 2,000 years or so, or something like Portuguese and Romanian, languages change pretty fast in large parts of the language. In other parts of it, they change more slowly, so you can focus on those. In some meanings, like the basic numbers, words generally change. Well, they change phonetically quite quickly, but they still they keep the same word. Whereas in other meanings, they change their words much more frequently. So those ones are less good for going back into the past. But we have, despite the big time depth of Indo-European and the big diversity, we have a big advantage, which is that we also have older written languages. So we have Latin from over 2,000 years ago. We have Greek, back to Mycenaean Greek, over 3,000 years ago. We have Hittite, about 3,500 years ago. We have Vedic Sanskrit. Not even sure exactly. There are no original surviving manuscripts or inscriptions, but certainly over 3,000 years old. We also have Avestan, similar time depth from the Iranic family, and we have all of these older languages, and it was in fact, it was the parallels between the older languages that were what first sort of tipped people off to the fact that this is far more similarity than you could expect by chance. So, and it's not just those words that I mentioned, the numbers 1 to 10. It was actually the old grammatical systems and certain endings that are so similar between Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and Avestan, and even Gothic, for example.
Yeah, I don't know much about this, Paul, but mother, for example, the word for mother appears to be very, very common across, right?
I mean, mother is actually a tricky word. It's a very good, obvious word that works, mother, brother, and father. Again, if you look at those in Hindi, or, they're so similar to the English ones still. Now, mother is actually quite tricky because it's almost universal that in any language, whether it's related or not, it will have the word for mother, not in all languages, but almost all, starts with a m. Yeah, it's one of the earliest syllables that children, when they're babbling, they can make. It's easy with the lips, m, and without controlling whether there is air flowing through your nose or not, so it tends to come out as a m. So you've really got to be quite careful with mother words. They almost always start with mama type words, and they often get replaced. Mother itself, as different to mum or mama, is actually a bit more indicative because it's got the sound in English, which, you know, and mater in Latin. This is a sound change that happened from t to the in English. But anyway, that's a very good one in Indo-European. But don't come along and then say, but in, you know, 500 languages around the world, they start with m, so it must be related. No, that's just a sort of universal thing. So
it's just
that
easy
particular
to
word you need
to pronounce for a baby.
Yeah, those are the first syllables that babies will come out with. Yeah.
And so you mentioned sort of the velocity of language changes. Some places it's fast, some places it's slow. Do we know why? What attribute controls sort of the velocity of language change?
Not well. We have some ideas, but you know, so there was a famous attempt to use this in the 50s when radiocarbon dating was getting going in archaeology. And this was, you know, of course, what they call the radiocarbon revolution. And some linguists were thinking, well, it would be great if we could also date our languages. So this technique was proposed on the basis of a few cases, and then there was some assumptions made that this rate of change would be fairly similar across all languages. And something like, of the standard list that there was used, about 200 words, they came up with this figure of 14% per millennium. But really, it then got tried out for a couple of decades. It was fairly widely used, but it fairly soon became clear that this just doesn't work, in that, you know, you got bad dates in known historical cases. And the problem is that even within that list, some of the meanings were changing very quickly. Some of them were changing much more slowly. And then, so basically people abandoned that method a long time ago. And because language changes so quickly in some cases and so slowly in others, so different parts of the list change differently. But what also happens is the key example that was used was a comparison of Icelandic and English. And now both of them are Germanic languages. They come from the Germanic branch of the Indo-European family. So they both go back to this Proto-Germanic ancestor language. But it turned out that English changed a lot more than Icelandic did. So there wasn't a standard rate, and you'd get the wrong result if you assume a standard rate of change. And one of the reasons put forward for this is that Icelandic, you know, Norse, as it then was, Old Norse, gets to Iceland, but from then on, from about the 9th century, it's pretty isolated. You know, there is occasional contact still going on with Scandinavia, but the contacts are very limited. It's a small population, and maybe that just meant that it was not changing very quickly. In contrast to England, so the Anglo-Saxons arrive and bring the ancestor of English to England, but then they mix with a bit of Latin and a bit of Celtic. There wasn't that much of a difference from Celtic, but in fact there was a mix of different tribes who came from the continent, the European continent, into England, and that already started some changes going, with mixing of different dialects. And then there was the Viking invasion of England, and half of England and large parts of Scotland were ruled effectively by the Danes or the Norwegians for many centuries, and they had a huge impact, bringing in loanwords. And probably people trying to communicate in these sort of Old Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse, sort of still being able to understand each other, but simplifying lots of things, getting rid of gender, getting rid of the, you know, nominative, accusative, genitive, dative. Well, genitive survive, but getting rid of a lot of the complexities, and just this contact accelerated change. And then in 1066 came the Norman invasion, where the Normans were speaking a form of, well, a variety of French, a Romance language, and that brought in a whole new host of loanwords, which replaced a big chunk of English vocabulary. So English vocabulary had this so much contact and so much impact from different languages that accelerated the changes. And in fact, if you look historically, so English changes a huge amount from the time of the Viking invasions and then the Norman invasion. But from about 1200 or 1300, it starts to stabilize as Norman French died out and English was more or less on its own in England. And then the change, so it went through this pulse of change and then it slowed down again. So it's just another illustration of, in this case, people think it's contact that with other languages that drove the changes. There are other cases as well. Sort of a language can have a sound system that's fairly stable, but then it can start to break down in a particular way, and it very quickly switches. You know, there's an instability and a lot of change until it reaches another stable, more stable system. French did something quite spectacular like this, and the same goes with grammar. Grammar systems can be stable a long time, change rapidly, and then stabilize again. So
it's fascinating research. So in some sense, you're connecting sort of migration of humans across the world. So half the world's population, so currently about 4 billion, let's say, have some sort of connection with the Indo-European languages. And we can, is this what you mean by sort of the linguistics archaeology, or I don't know exactly what you call it, to sort of look at how people moved across the globe?
Yeah, so effectively, what the fact that English is related to Hindi, for example, or to Persian, or to Albanian and Greek, and almost all languages of Europe, the fact that they are related to each other means that there was this big expansion. Okay, and it goes back a long way. It goes back many millennia. So now it's a territorial expansion in one sense. Now it almost always implies at least some people were moving. Otherwise, the language can't get into a new area. But there are two ways a language can spread. Either the people move and therefore carry their language with them. Or so if you look at where English speakers, French speakers, Spanish speakers, and Portuguese speakers went to in the New World, then you get, depending on which places which of them went, you get their languages spreading to those areas, North and South America. Now, alternatively, most people can just stay put, but the language can spread if people learn it. So you normally get a bit of a mixture of both. So it wasn't that the entire population of the Americas was replaced by Europeans. And of course, some indigenous languages survive in the Americas, but a lot of people who were at least, partly Native American ended up learning European languages. So the language continues to expand without actually, needing to have a huge, the whole population doesn't need to be replaced. So the Roman Empire is a similar thing. There were some places where Roman people settled out of Italy, out of Rome and out of Italy. So there was some expansion with people, but there was also a big process of people in different parts of the Roman Empire learning Latin. So the language is spreading by, it can be a migration. There's usually at least some migration. And certainly if there is a very big migration of people, then you would expect the languages to come with it. So archaeologists and geneticists are also trying to track movements of people in prehistory. And what we're trying to do also in this article is to try and sort of fit everything together in the right place at the right time and for the right reason. Yeah. So we know there's some expansion happened. We know that people moving will be a big part of it. And we think we know where it started and in which directions and time frame it's spreading. So we try and link it with what we see of population movements in genetics and ancient DNA and in archaeology.
So what do you mean by the hybrid model for the origin? So there's competing hypotheses here, right? I get it, right?
The title you mentioned, The Sampled Ancestors, is about a particular approach to doing these language trees, these language phylogenies. So we can come back to that later. But the hybrid model for the origin of Indo-European languages, it's a hybrid of two of the main theories that have been around for the last, certainly in one case for many decades, almost a century, but certainly the sort of formal presentation in the 50s 60s, and then particularly then another theory, the farming hypothesis, in the 80s. So these hypotheses have been sort of back and forth between the disciplines and in this debate. So one of the hypotheses, the theories, so there's the steppe theory and there's what you can call the farming theory, sometimes known as the Anatolian theory. Anatolia, i.e. parts of Turkey where there's an Anatolian branch of the Indo-European languages as well. But basically, it's talking about the part of what's now Turkey that was part of the Fertile Crescent, which is one of the places where agriculture started. So there's a steppe hypothesis and a farming hypothesis. The steppe hypothesis, so this is part of the Eurasian steppe, but it's the part of it that's north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So it's what's now Ukraine and southern Russia, principally. And the other, so that's the steppe hypothesis. The farming hypothesis would be, well, it comes from somewhere, the northern part of the Fertile Crescent. So that would be, there's actually a comment on our paper saying, well, why don't you call it Kurdistan? Well, it's actually, we call it south of the Caucasus. We don't call it Kurdistan just because there are various ways you could call this. It's Armenian. It could have been. We're not very precise about it really, because it's hard to be precise. 8,000 years ago, we're looking at genetic profiles, and one of the genetic profiles that may be a candidate for this is called Caucasus hunter-gatherer / Iranian. Okay, and what they mean is just because the clearest examples of this ancestry were found first in hunter-gathering populations from the south of the Caucasus, including modern-day Armenia, and farmers from part of what is now Iran, so the Zagros, where early herding and farming populations. So that's the farming hypothesis would say somewhere south of the Caucasus or in the northern Fertile Crescent. It's basically the borderlands between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Armenia, somewhere around there. So that would be the farming hypothesis homeland. And also they're proposing these theories propose different time depths. So the steppe hypothesis would have an expansion mostly from about 6,000 or 5,500 years ago. And the farming hypothesis would say that it was a lot earlier, so maybe up to, well, with the spread of farming. Now that would actually take us back 10,000, 9,000, 10,000 years. It depends on whether there's an intensification or a secondary spread of farming somewhat later.
So the steppe hypothesis, does it include farming?
Well, you could also call it the pastoralist hypothesis if you want. It has been traditionally associated with the expansion of the horse, okay, the horse domestication and a pastoralist economy, let's say, a pastoralist way of life. Although actually these people were still farming as well. They weren't riding their horses, probably. They were mostly eating horses, and then they would be eating secondary products as well from horse milk, ultimately. But it's, and you have to be aware of the anachronism of thinking of these people as if they were the Huns or the Mongols. This came millennia later with stirrups and saddles and a lot of horse breeding to create very powerful, fast horses for warfare. And they've got metal weapons. This is a completely, it's an anachronism to say that these were the Proto-Indo-Europeans. We have to go back at least 5,500, 6,000 years to the steppe, where things were quite different and their use of horses was quite different. But they could pull chariots, certainly, and wagons by around this period. So yes, but they weren't not farming. They were also farming crops, but there was a balance between farming and a lot of pastoralism as well. That was also important for their diet, let's say.
So it's sort of they had two different things going on in some sense, and then there's sort of a spread issue, right? So suppose you buy the steppe hypothesis, how did they where did they go from where they started? Did they go west and east together? Did they go east and come back to the west? Did they go west and come back to the east? So there are a lot of questions around it, right?
There are so effectively both hypotheses, both theories are saying that there was a homeland. This would be the normal. So in the case of the Romance languages, there was a homeland. It was around Rome. It was Latium, yeah, where they spoke Latin. And out of that homeland, out of that small homeland, the whole family spread. Now, in the case of Proto-Indo-European, again, basically a language family implies it used to be a single proto-language in a relatively small region, and then it expands, and it's only the expansion that means that the divergence starts, the geographical divergence starts. So we're looking for a homeland, and if it's and so whether it was on the steppe or south of the Caucasus, ultimately it expanded in multiple directions out of that homeland. So when we talk about a hybrid, what we're actually proposing is that the original homeland was south of the Caucasus, but there was a fairly early movement. One of the expansion routes out of the Caucasus went onto the steppe, the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black Sea. And from there was a secondary movement into Europe, primarily. So both of that, I mean, in the article, we have maps as well, showing sort of the different hypothesis routes. But effectively, yeah, there's a lot riding on this. So, for example, to India and Iran and places in between, so Afghanistan, Pakistan, one of the key questions is did that huge branch of Indo-European, the Indo-Iranic branch, did that just come with farming more or less from the Fertile Crescent through the Iranian plateau into the Indus and then ultimately on to the Ganges? Or did it start out on the steppe and come through Central Asia and then come through into the Indus and Iran and the Ganges? So that's a big difference for the origins of all. These are 80% of the languages of India.
Right.
So it's a big question.
So this is where the ancient DNA question comes in, right? So can we learn something from that?
Certainly. I mean, it's one of the biggest leaps forward in trying to solve this question has come since about 2015, once ancient DNA was really coming on stream and we were getting more and more samples across time and space. We need a lot of sampling really, because we need to sample as many places as we can across the Indo-European speaking regions, and we need to sample all the different time depths as well. And so what ancient DNA can do is it can try and trace ancestries, and it's not really directly tracing movements, but what it can trace is when in a certain region, suddenly you see an influx not suddenly, but from a certain point. So up to about 7,000 years ago, on the steppe north of the Black Sea, there is a type of ancestry that's a sort of standard Eurasian, northeastern Eurasian ancestry. But then from about 7,000 years ago, you start getting significant amounts of this. So you're testing, DNA from human remains through time in that region. And from about 7,000, you start seeing a different ancestry, a mix of two ancestries, the original one that was there, and then another one coming in. Now, and this other one is the one I referred to earlier, that's first found south of the Caucasus and in northwestern Iran, the CHG Iranian. So it's not specifically documenting a movement, but it is documenting that in the steppe, from about 7,000 years ago, you suddenly get this other ancestry arriving, and it makes up about it fairly quickly in archaeological time frame, comes to make up about 50% of the ancestry of people on the steppe. So that looks like ancient DNA is showing us a movement at a particular point in time. So
really, really fascinating, Paul. So National Geographic used to run a program. I don't know if you've seen this. You can send a saliva sample and it'll show you where your DNA is from. It's going to show you a heat map. And my family is not known to ever left South India. When I was growing up, there was no sign of them ever leaving. But my heat map showed up in Rome, Netherlands, and Portugal. So I put that down to sort of colonialism and trade, more tactically, right? 100 years, 300 years. But I wondered if that type of data is also useful to think about your research in some way.
Certainly, modern DNA is used extensively in these databases. Obviously, in fact, modern DNA is far more plentiful. It's much easier to get, much cheaper to get. You don't have to go and dig in archaeological sites, and you can get it from most places. Yeah. Now, and then of course you can track ancestry with it. Ancient DNA is incredibly valuable, of course, because it's from that time. People, you do radiocarbon datings of the human remains, so you know exactly pretty much when where these people were, and at least when they were buried, and how long ago. And then you use it all, but obviously you use the modern DNA as well. In the case of a connection between India and Europe, yes, obviously you would think about the colonial period, but you could there are also migrations out of India into Europe by the Romani, for example, is an Indian language spoken in Europe, and so there are bits of Indian DNA in Europe and have been for a few millennia. So it can go both ways. And also, I think a lot of interpretation is needed with these with this DNA sampling, because what it tends to they will tell you, they'll find something in your DNA, some markers in your DNA, and they will be able to tell you where that marker is most frequent. Yeah. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have ancestors who came from there.
Right.
It's just that, it might be 10% in one region and 90% in another region. You could just be the 10% that always had it in your region in some cases. Yeah. So a lot of people jump to sort of face value interpretations, but you need to be, you basically need to talk to a geneticist about this and really get these things, get it all cleared up. There are often other explanations than the one that might sound most appealing or romantic to the person who actually DNA has been tested. So.
Yeah, so in one of your papers, you have a few controversies, which is, so I thought we could talk a little bit about it. So one controversy you talk about here is, did the speakers of Proto-Indo-European already have the technology of the wheel and domesticated horses? We talked a bit about this. If so, then our root date of 8120 before present, BP, would be too early, since these developments only came about a couple of millennia later. So what's your thinking there? So then it seems like a controversy, right?
Yes, I mean, the step hypothesis has in many ways been sort of founded and reinforced on this technique. I mean, people have given it lots of different names. It's called linguistic paleontology by some people. It's called words and things by others. It's called cultural reconstruction, and there's quite a lot of controversy about whether this method really works. So to go back to that first example of the words from 1 to 10, because we can work out what the original words were in Indo-European language. We can more or less reconstruct the sounds back to how they would have been, not exactly how they would have been pronounced, but something similar to that in Proto-Indo-European, and that's what linguists call reconstruction. And because these words mean almost always 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in all of those languages, then you can assume reasonably safely that they meant 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 at the Proto-Indo-European stage, probably. Except there are actually some issues with it. So there's The 7 word looks like the 7 word in a different language family in the Semitic languages. So maybe it was a loan word. Maybe it wasn't an original word. Some of the words get sort of reinvented. So words for 10 can be reinvented. So 9 can be reinvented as an almost 10 word. But it looks like the Proto-Indo-Europeans, if I had to take a bet on it, I would say the Proto-Indo-Europeans probably could count to 10. It looks on the basis of all these words that survive. So people have tried to do the same with words for horse, for example. And it looks like you can reconstruct a word for horse to Proto-Indo-European. And it looks like it meant horse. Yeah. So presumably the speakers of Proto-Indo-European knew the horse. But what that doesn't mean is that they had domesticated it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's actually making another assumption on the basis of that. And then the wheel words are particularly interesting because there are words that end up meaning wheel end up that mean wheel in modern Indo-European languages and that already meant wheel in the earliest Indo-European languages we have records of, like Greek and Latin. But actually there's not one single word. There are 2 words that crop up a lot meaning wheel. And one of them, for example, the word that became wheel in English is the one that became kuklos in Greek, which is a cycle. It's actually then got borrowed into English in the sense of a cycle. And you can see the connection between a cycle and wheel. In fact, a bicycle, of course, they refer literally to wheels. But cycle doesn't only mean, we use it for things that aren't normally literally wheels. And in fact, these words in the different languages, we can go back to Proto-Indo-European and find a string of sounds, and it means something to do with rotation. It actually looks like it literally means something like a turn.
Yeah.
So had they invented the wheel yet, or were they just talking about things that turn? They had a concept of turning and cyclicality and something that rolls, but did they or did they come across or invent the wheel later and then call it, look at this, we've got this turn. So it's not when we're reconstructing, we can reconstruct the sounds fairly confidently. We're a bit less confident in reconstructing exact meanings. We know roughly what set of meanings. It's something to do with rotation or cyclicality.
Yeah.
And another nice case is the pole star, for example. So if you talk in English about the wheeling of the heavens, you mean the stars during the night turning around the pole star, and that pole star word is also related to this kuklos root. So it's not clear what they obviously knew about rotation.
Right.
But since when have humans not known about rotation? It doesn't allow us to say this language can't have been around until after the wheel was invented. Okay.
The engineer in me says, Paul, that if they knew rotation and cycles, they would have found the wheel. But I know nothing about that.
Well, there's an interesting case because it's sort of famous that in the Andes, for example, they didn't really have wheels. I mean, in the Andes, they're less useful given the terrain. Now, in Mesoamerica, there are wheeled toys. There are toys with wheels, so you can pull them along. There you can Google them. There's a big debate about them. Well, if they invented toys with wheels, then why didn't they use wheels much more for actual transport?
Yeah, same thing in the Indus Valley civilization. They had a lot of toys with wheels, but it's unclear if they actually had wheels in real practical things.
I mean, the main thing is when you invent a wheel, if you have domesticated animals that can pull really heavy things, then the wheel can start being more useful. But if you have very, very heavy wooden wheels with very heavy axles and very heavily built wagons, but actually, the net gain from just having a lot of people carrying things is not so clear, or else using your animals to carry things directly rather than pull. If you've built a road network, then okay, the wheels start getting more useful. But until you've done that, and you don't do that without inventing the wheel. So, the actual utility early on is less clear. Now, when spoked wheels come in, then, then the technology sort of reaches its tipping point and takes off. And then, you get these virtuous circles of technological development. But, cyclicality, you just need to look at stars to have a word for cyclicality.
Yeah, so I want to touch on a couple more controversies that you have listed here. So did the Indo-Iranic and Balto-Slavic branches remain together for longer than other main branches? That's a joint late Indo-Iranic plus Balto-Slavic mega branch of the Indo-European family. So if I understand correctly, Paul, the Balto-Slavic is not part of the Indo-European, right? It's a sort of a separate thing altogether?
No, it's a branch.
It's a branch.
It's a sub-branch, yeah. So within the Indo-European family, there are about, 10 to 12 major branches, depending on how you want to, that we know of, that survived at least long enough for us to have evidence of them. There are a few other tantalizing hints of inscriptions in the Mediterranean that but we can't really place them well enough, but potential other branches. But one of the biggest branches is Balto-Slavic, which is a combination of the Baltic branch. So you get Indo-European, and then you get a Balto-Slavic branch, and that splits into a Baltic branch and a Slavic branch. So Baltic today is Lithuanian and Latvian, and there were other languages that died out not too long ago. And Slavic is a big bunch of languages: Russian, Polish, Serbo-Croat, Bulgarian, Slovene, Slovak, Czech, a whole Ukrainian, Belarusian, a whole bunch of the Slav languages. Hungarian, no, that's not even in Hungarian is a latecomer to Europe, much later, sort of invaders from Asia in the 9th century. So Hungarian is not Indo-European. It's one of the very few European languages that isn't. So you have a big Balto-Slavic branch, and you have this huge Indo-Iranic branch. But the question is, between Proto-Indo-European and then the emergence of Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranic as different branches, were those two branches actually closer together at one stage in this early mega branch, Balto-Slavic Indo-Iranic? Okay, and the reason this is important is because it's a key question. I mentioned earlier the question of how the Indic and Iranic branches got to India and Iran. Did they just go through Iran from south of the Caucasus, or did they come from the steppe and go through Central Asia and then come south into Iran and India? Now, if it's true that there was a Balto-Slavic Indo-Iranic branch after the original Proto-Indo-European stage, then one's assuming that Balto-Slavic, they're spoken in Russia, Ukraine, and on the Baltic coast. One's assuming that their ancestor was probably somewhere in Eastern Europe or on the steppe. So if Indo-Iranic is closely related to them, then it too probably was up there, because they wouldn't have separated in the first separation from a southern homeland. So supporters of the steppe hypothesis have argued that if your interpretation of the language data is that there was indeed a Balto-Slavic Indo-Iranic mega branch, then that's used as an argument to say, so that proves they must have been on the steppe. But that's not actually. It's one of the hypotheses about the early branching structure of Indo-European, but it's not the only one, and it's not the dominant hypothesis. It's one of the main hypotheses, but we look at it, and in our supplement to our article, we go through where some of the key arguments that have been put forward to favor that, and they're actually, in my view, very weak, and these parallels could just have arisen by other means, or indeed arose even later in some cases.
Right. So another controversy here, Paul. So was the Indo-Iranic branch intrusive into India and Iran? from the steppe, Central Asia, at a relatively late date. So supporters of the steppe hypothesis have usually argued that this date could be no earlier than the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization. That's 3800 before present. Because they also assume that the people of the IVC, the Indus Valley civilization, did not speak Indo-Iranic. Itself a controversial assumption, you say here. So there are a lot of hypotheses on India itself. I grew up in South India. There's a sort of a Dravidian culture, and Indians believe there was sort of an Aryan invasion into India. I don't know anything about the history. So how does this all fit into what people think or believe today?
So in India, the whole, it's been quite controversial, the whole Indo-European, the steppe hypothesis, even the farming hypothesis, because both of them are effectively stating that the languages of northern India, so not Dravidian. Yeah, Dravidian, again, there are hypotheses about where Dravidian came from, but I think most people are assuming Dravidian was already in India at the time when Indo-European languages, so the Indic branch. So we talked about mega branches. The Indo-Iranic branch then itself separates into Indic and Iranic. And in fact, there's a third branch called Nuristani, because spoken in Nuristan, and that doesn't. There's an argument about where it fits into Indo-Iranic. Is it generally tends to be seen as a small third branch of its own. So in some aspects it looks more like Iranic, in some aspects it looks more like Indic. But these languages are not very well known and researched really. But anyway, to get back to it, so the Dravidians are presumably one of the populations already in India, and then these languages come in from, they are related. They go back to a Proto-Indo-European, and they come in from somewhere originally further west. Now, was it south of the Caucasus with early farming, or was it the steppe with pastoralism? And if they come through the steppe, then they come into Central Asia first. And the steppe hypothesis has always assumed that because they're coming from the steppe, there's a sort of, an Aryan invasion. Aryan, by the way, is the same word root as Iran today. Okay. So, and it basically in this context means the Indo-European speakers who come into India, and Iran. Now, so there was Sir Mortimer Wheeler, when he was doing his research in the Indus Valley civilization, they see this destruction by fire, a level in the archaeological remains where it seems there's a destruction by fire of these cities. That's the so-called collapse around 3,800 years ago. And Sir Mortimer Wheeler has this great expression: Indra stands accused. This is Indra. This is the Indo-Iranians coming in, invading from the steppe and destroying the Indus Valley civilization. Now that's fairly old stuff. I'm not sure how many specialists of the Indus Valley civilization would really see it like that. And the alternative hypothesis that Colin Renfrew's proposal that that Indo-European languages started out with farming in the Fertile Crescent, and then just spread eastwards through Iran and reach and bring farming effectively. Farming gets to the Indus from Central Asia, from Western Asia, from the Fertile Crescent. Hence, the crops and the animals are a similar package to the one that starts on the Indus. And then the Indus Valley civilization in Renfrew's model would be early speakers of a sort of Proto-Indo-Iranic, that branch, the Indo-Iranic branch, the early Indo-Iranic branch. And then, of course, the expansion later into the Ganges and the expansion down the Ganges, that would be the Iranic branch separating. So if you look today for where the fault line is between the Iranic and the Indic sub-branches of Indo-Iranic, it's more or less the Indus. It goes through Pakistan. It's the western half of Pakistan and further west, they're all speaking Iranic languages, and the eastern half and India, northern India, are speaking Indic languages. So it means was the Indus Valley civilization speaking an Indic language already, or an early ancestor of Indo-Iranic, or were they not Indo-Europeans and replaced by Indo-Europeans coming from the steppe a lot later? So it's a big controversy, and it's one of the central issues that still needs to be resolved.
Yeah, it's an awesome research area. It's going to give us a lot of information. So do you have any concluding thoughts? Anything you want to say?
I just hope that people will find it interesting enough to look into it. I mean, as you said at the start, what I do is I started off as a historical linguist, learning languages I like, and then comparing languages and trying to reconstruct and go back in the past. But really, I'm now more of a prehistorian.
Yeah.
I worked a lot with archaeologists and geneticists. And for me, the languages are one of the tools. They open up this window on our past that is, we really mustn't overlook. You can say a huge amount about the history and origins of anywhere if you look at the languages. But most disciplines, so in archaeology, they tend not to think about languages so much. Geneticists also don't, and when they do, I would like people. I'm glad people are interested in the topic, and I'd like people to realize how valuable a linguistic perspective can be for working out who we know, where we come from, and our prehistory.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for taking part, Paul. I really enjoyed it. Learned something.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.